Hello, everyone, and welcome to the official launch of the 2023 Global Terrorism Index. We thank you for joining us today. This is the 10th edition of the Global Terrorism Index, which, as we will discuss today, provides an analysis of the impact of terrorism around the world. It looks into both new developing trends as well as long-term trends. Today, we will be hearing from two speakers who will discuss the finding of the report and also the impact in the application of this work internationally. If you should have any questions for our speakers, I kindly invite you to use the Q&A function that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And after both of the presentations, we will answer as many of your questions as possible. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Steve Killelea, the founder and executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace, who will present the findings of the report. Steve, over to you.
Right. Well, thank you for the introduction, Leah. Now, what I'm going to do is show you a presentation. So just bear with me for a few seconds while I get this presentation up. Presentation itself is a very, very fast-paced presentation and will take about 20 to 25 minutes to get through. Now, can we see that on our screens?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, look, thank you everyone for attending. I think you're going to find this an exceptionally interesting presentation. Like this year's report's probably been one of the more complex ones, I think, which we've done in the 10 years which we've been doing the index. Now, I'll start off with a little bit of background on the Institute for Economics and Peace. It was set up to understand the intersection between business, peace, and economics, place a special emphasis on metrics to measure peace, and then to ascribe an economic value to changes in peace. We've got 6 offices around the world, headquartered in Sydney, Australia, New York, Brussels, which is where Leah is today, The Hague, Mexico City, and Harare in Africa. The work's used extensively by most of the major multilateral organisations. So we do research and paid research, as well as using our work, people like the OECD, World Bank, United Nations, Commonwealth Secretariat. Work's now included in thousands, if not tens of thousands of university courses. And to give you an idea, last year we had 28 billion media impressions. But to give you an idea of just how much resonance the work's having, just in the last 6 months, we've had 20 billion media impressions. So the impact of the Institute's growing all the time. We have a whole range of products. The Global Terrorism Index is the one we're talking about today, but obviously we have other products like the Global Peace Index, Ecological Threat Report. We have training exercises with the Positive Peace Academy. Then we have an ambassador program. Got about 5,000 ambassadors, with another 500 will be training in the next couple of months. All right, now without more to do, let's launch into the index. So it's now in its 10th year. It ranks 163 countries and independent territories. That's about 99.7% of the world's population. It's also, we've got contributions for a number of international experts. It's developed by us. We use data from an organisation called Dragonfly and their TerrorismTracker database. Now let's move into the results. So we'll just move through some of the highlights. Well, if we look at it, there's really been no improvement in terrorism in the last 3 years. It's remained pretty constant. And that's after 3 years of very, very steep improvement. So that is concerning. So the number of countries which recorded death from terrorism in the last 3 years has ranged from 43 to 42. So again, you can see quite constant. 25 countries improved in 2022 compared to 24 that deteriorated. Sub-Saharan Africa recorded the largest increase in deaths, where deaths increased by 8%. Now, surprisingly, it was the only region in the world which actually recorded a deterioration. All other regions actually improved. So the Sahel is the epicenter of terrorism. In fact, 43% of all deaths caused by terrorism globally occurred in the region. And deaths in the MENA continue to decline. It's 6 years straight of declining deaths there. In fact, the number dropped from 32% down to 791. The only exception being Syria, which we will come to later. Now, this is a quick mud map of the world, gives you an idea of the centres of terrorism. Obviously, you can see the Sahel over to the left-hand side of Africa. Find the Middle East and South Asia really the hotspots for terrorism globally, and obviously Somalia and moving over into Myanmar, which is increasing in the number of deaths from terrorism over the last couple of years. Now, two fundamental changes we can see this year, and they're both really worth mentioning. So now, Taliban, since it's been able to take control of the government in Afghanistan, it's no longer considered to be a terrorist group. And ISIS is claiming less attacks, especially in the Sahel. So this does distort the top line results somewhat. So now, we looked at deaths by terrorism, the actual number was down 9% this year. But if we excluded Afghanistan and we looked at the rest of the world, then deaths would have been up 4%. And I think that's a more accurate representation of what happened last year. Now, similarly, with Islamic State, deaths there are down 16%. Now, there's been an increase in a category called unknown jihadists. That's particularly true in the areas where ISIS is most active, like Burkina Faso and Mali. And so if we now proportioned a number of those deaths over to ISIS, the deaths for ISIS would have increased. So there's still a major threat globally. So those things need to be taken back into account when understanding it. Now, the lethality of each attack has increased. In fact, the attacks have become more deadly. So the deaths per attack increased by 26% in the last 12 months. And this is a sign of just the effectiveness of the major groups. That includes Islamic State and Al-Shabaab, which are the two most deadliest groups in the last 12 months. Now, one of the more dramatic changes, if we look over the last 6 years, has been deaths caused by suicide bombings. This is in the MENA region. And so that's down from almost 2,000 deaths to 6 in 2022. And that would tend to show that the Islamic State and the Al-Qaeda are interested more in maintaining the lives of their troops rather than sacrificing them in suicide bombs, which means effectively they're probably finding it harder to recruit in some ways. Islamic State remains the most deadly group in the world, about a bit over 1,800 deaths, and that was in 21 different countries around the world. So they're still active and on a large scale. So the Balochistan Liberation Army in Pakistan, that became the fastest growing terrorist group last year, 233 deaths. That was 9 times higher than in 2021. And they're also the most lethal group in the world with 8 deaths per attack. So this gives you a really quick overview of the various regions of the world. I think the only thing the two things which are really worth noting is sub-Saharan Africa and the deterioration there. That's mainly the Sahel. North America only consists of 2 countries, so it's then very, very low rates. So the improvements, although they seem substantial, it's off a very, very low space. But the Middle East is probably the area second most affected by global terrorism, and we can see that there's been quite a strong improvement there. So this gives you a quick idea of the 10 countries with the worst scores of the Global Terrorism Index. You'll note that every one of those countries is engaged in some form of conflict. Afghanistan's still at the top, and that's mainly because of the methodology. We take a 5-year trailing average on deaths, attacks, injuries and kidnappings to work out the score. Burkina Faso has risen quite dramatically. Iraq pleasingly has improved. Nigeria also pleasingly has improved. This is quite interesting. So if we look at the 5 most impacted countries through terrorism, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Mali, and Burkina Faso, we find the number of deaths have increased by 8%. However, we now look at all the other countries, what we find is there's been a 26% fall in the number of deaths. And this shows how terrorism is really becoming more concentrated, and then terrorist organisations are very, very fast at adapting and finding the best fit for them. And that's in countries with weak institutions, poor governance, and areas which the government can't really control. And again, this sort of drives home the same point. So this takes the 10 countries most impacted by terrorism, and we can see they're responsible for 85% of all the terrorist deaths globally. This gives you an idea of the countries which had the biggest increases in deaths from terrorism. Burkina Faso at the top, Pakistan, which we've already spoken a little bit about, and Mali. Then you see a sharp drop to places like Somalia, Myanmar, and Mozambique. Now, the opposite end, the countries where it improved, the strongest, Afghanistan, but again, a lot of that's related to the Taliban no longer being classified as a terrorist organisation. We've got Niger, it improved quite dramatically as well. A lot of, I think, the Islamic State from West Africa, its fighters moved into Burkina Faso and Mali. We can see the improvement in Iraq, which continues a 6-year trend. Now let's have a bit of a look at some of the trends which we're seeing in terrorism currently. So what this graph here does is it looks at the different regions of the world. What it shows is just the number of deaths caused by the region. So what I'd like you to do is focus on the green bar, which is the Sahel, and you can just see how that's increased over time. And you can now look at Iraq, which is the yellow, and you can see the vast improvements there and over time. So if you move out of the major countries, what you find is that the blue bar at the bottom, what that does gives an indication of all other countries in the world. So the rate there has stayed pretty constant over the last 15 years. And this gives you, again, another idea of just the different terrorist groups and the number of deaths they've caused. So if we look at the very bottom bar, that's Islamic State. We can see that it came from nowhere in 2013. Al-Shabaab's the red one. JNIM is the light blue bar above that, which is which we can see slowly increasing. Now, this gives you an idea of the distribution of deaths by country. So you'll note there were 42 countries which recorded death this year. That's down from 44 the prior year and 43 the year before that. But again, we can see the last 3 years, it's been pretty constant. 2015, it peaked at about 56 countries and then sort of improved quite dramatically to 2020, after which it stayed fairly well the same. Now, one of the things that we've noticed, there's a very, very strong relationship between ecological degradation and terrorism. In fact, 8 of the 10 countries most affected by terrorism also suffer from major water shortages, and 8 of the 10 countries also suffer from some of the highest population growth in the world. And I think the key message here is there's a strong relationship between a whole series of issues and the background conditions for terrorism. And obviously conflict is one of them. 88% of all attacks occur in a conflict zone, 98% of all deaths occur in conflict zones. But mixed in or amongst all of that, you've got weak governance, you've got rampant crime, You've got ecological stress and a range of other issues as well as high population growth. So to address these problems, we've really got to look at a broader range of mix, and particularly it comes back to viewing them systemically, and we'd see positive peace as being one of the frameworks, which is very helpful in that environment. So let's come down and have a bit of a look at the Sahel now. So this gives you an idea of where the deaths have been increasing, where they've been decreasing. So you can see Niger, there's the areas of Niger now where it's improved. That's related to Boko Haram maybe. And we can come over and see the improvements in the Middle East as well. You can see the deteriorations are all really in the Sahel. Now, so we look at this here. This graph gives you an idea of just when we're looking at the terrorism deaths, just how much they've increased in the Sahel compared to the rest of Africa. And again, this one sort of gives you an idea of conflict and just the way conflict has actually increased over time. And so we can see the number of conflict deaths or battlefield deaths increased from 3,000 up to close to 12,000 in the last 6 years. Again, it brings home just the relationship between conflict and terrorism. This is an interesting graph. It gives you an idea of the number of coups which have happened in the Sahel in recent years. So what we can see here, in 2022, there were six coups in the Sahel, of which 4 were unsuccessful, 2 were successful. And so we can see that's the highest level of coup activity, certainly in the last 6 years. Now, this set of graphs is really interesting. So this is, when you look at this is the sentiment which have been found through surveys of France in the areas where they had colonies. So you can see there's a net negative perception of France in the countries where they had colonies. Niger's not so bad, but now if we come through now and we have a look at what's the ratings for both Russia and the US through the Sahel, we can see that their ratings are actually improving. In fact, when we look at their approval ratings for both Russia and the US, other than 1 or 2 countries, it's all over 50%. The US is slightly higher, up around 60%, in the low 60s, where Russia's in the low 50s. So that's quite interesting ramifications, and you can see that in many ways the withdrawal of France probably matches the sentiments of many of the countries in which it's had its troops. However, the good news is that there's probably room for the United States and probably also Russia, although they probably don't want it, to be able to pick up some of that slack. Now let's have a look at terrorism in the West. So terrorism in the West really is dramatically improved since 2017 at the height of the Islamic State attacks. And we can see that we're down to 40 attacks in the last 12 months. However, there were 19 deaths. That's up from 9 the prior year. But 11 of those deaths were caused by one attack in the US in a supermarket in Buffalo, New York. So in many ways, that's good news. We go switch over to the MENA region. We'll have a quick look there. So as we're looking at the MENA region again, we can see with this graph the number of deaths caused in the MENA region compared to the rest of the world. So if we go back to 2016, about 60% of all deaths happened in the MENA region. However, when we look down to 2022, that's down to 12%. So that's quite a dramatic turnaround in that period of time. Again, if we start to look at the MENA region, we start to look at the various terrorist groups. Again, if we look at the light blue bar in the center there, that's Islamic State. And if we look at the graph carefully, we can see since 2019, there's been no improvement in the numbers. So it's still a formidable force, although nothing like what it was in 2016-17. And that, my friends, is the end of the presentation. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'll stop it now and I'll pass it back over to Leah.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was an excellent presentation, and I see some questions already rolling into the Q&A function. I'd like to remind the audience to please continue to ask your questions as we continue on. So we will now turn to Mr. Masood Karimipour. Mr. Karimipour currently serves as the Chief of Terrorism Prevention Branch in the UN Office on Drugs and Crime based in Vienna. He has been a rule of law and criminal justice policy and development advisor and criminal law litigator and trial attorney for 35 years. He has served as UNODC Strategic Coordinator Advisor and as UNODC's regional representative in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as the regional representative in Central Asia. Mr. Karimipour, I hand the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you, Steve, for that brilliant presentation. I'm afraid I don't have the razzle-dazzle PowerPoint presentation that you had, but then I also don't want to repeat anything you said. So let me go ahead and first of all, offer my congratulations to the Institute for Economics and Peace on the occasion of this launch of the 2023 Global Terrorism Index. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to say a few words about UNODC and what we do and how the 2023 Global Terrorism Index is important to our work. UNODC has been delivering on its mandate to support countries prevent and counter terrorism for more than 20 years. The way we do it is we design programs to implement the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy and the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We help countries identify gaps, reform policies, strengthen laws through legislative action, and strengthen institutions through capacity building of professionals. We help build platforms of interagency cooperation and international cooperation. And through this work, we contribute to peace, development, and human rights, which are the main pillars of the UN mandate. So as you can see, we already have much in common with Institute of Economics and Peace. Now, critical to our effort is access to information, data, and analysis to inform policy, planning, and practice. So in addition to UN-conducted country assessments, we have turned time and again to the Global Terrorism Index for data, analysis, and insight. Indeed, you can go ahead and fairly describe us as consummate consumers of the data in the Global Terrorism Index. The previous editions of the GTI have provided the global counterterrorism community with valuable data. This 2023 edition follows the same great tradition. It offers far too much substantive content for me to do it justice in just a few minutes. Steve already offered some highlights, so please allow me to offer a few observations and only a few highlights of particular relevance to our work. So let's start at the end. That is the conclusions of the 2023 GTI. There are three conclusions of the index that I would like to highlight. First, the Sahel region is now the epicenter of terrorism, with the Sahel accounting for more terrorism deaths in 2022 than both South Asia and the Middle East and North Africa combined. Deaths in the Sahel constituted 43% of the global total in 2022, compared to just 1% in 2007. Ecological stresses, weak governance, lack of basic services, lack of social economic opportunities, local grievances, and vast spaces that are difficult to monitor are among the factors that create conditions conducive to terrorism. Now, these are not merely statistical data points. These are matters of life and death to the people of the Sahel. I know because just 2 weeks ago, I was meeting with parliamentarians and community leaders of the Sahelian countries. The Institute for Economics and Peace was there too, represented by Mr. Serge Strubans, whose excellent briefing to that audience on these trends was sobering and alarming since the wake-up call in the room. And indeed, the presentation and the further dialogue led to a call for collective action by the participants. UNODC and countries of the region are well served by the GTI and would do well to review plans in light of the GTI data. We've been engaged in the Sahel, providing countries with the tools and capacities they need to prevent terrorism and its financing, and to use the national legal frameworks and international conventions to bring perpetrators to justice. In the Lake Chad Basin, we're providing support on collecting and using battlefield evidence to be used in judicial processes. We also work to strengthen the understanding and the skills of criminal justice officials to work across agencies, to share intelligence and identify terrorist networks and those who fund them, including through organized crime activities. We also promote a very inclusive approach to counterterrorism at the strategic and programmatic level. So, and I'll get to that in a minute, but suffice it to say that criminal justice system, while it may be the main channel through dealing with the crime of terrorism, there is much to be done outside the judicial processes to prevent terrorism in the first place. Now, we're prioritizing support to the coastal countries in West Africa too. The GTI's trend analysis of terrorism in Togo and Benin, countries that had been previously mostly unaffected, is alarming. Although the index says that the number of terrorism deaths were relatively small when compared to neighboring countries, we see recruitment and radicalization being on the rise, which may be an indication of an adverse trend in the future. So the time to act is now. The time to prevent the conditions from getting worse is now. And in UNODC, we're a big believer in prevention, and an ounce of prevention being better than a pound of cure. And so we're working with countries to adopt a more set of preventive strategies and actions. Now, we're looking to scale up our support to these countries to prevent terrorist networks from establishing a foothold, as they've done in other countries of the Sahel. And the GTI report comes at a perfect time for us to work with decision makers and policymakers to present a wake-up call for them too. Let me move to the second conclusion of the GTI that I'd like to highlight. Nearly all terrorism takes place in countries involved in conflict. 97% of all terrorism-related deaths between 2007 and 2022 occurred in countries involved in conflict. In 2022, the 16 countries most impacted by terrorism were all defined as being in conflict. One of the key conclusions of the index is that next to all terrorist attacks occur in countries involved in conflict. Here, the stakes are high and action is, time is of the essence to take action. Conflict zones are also known to be disproportionately affected by illegal mining and trafficking in precious metals. Mineral supply chains are often linked to child abuse, human trafficking, forced labor, and other human rights violations. And with high percentages of young people being affected in these countries, and this presents the risk of the future for young people who lack social economic opportunities to become more vulnerable to the narratives of violent extremism. Now, this poses additional challenges for countries because it's often difficult to receive international assistance in theaters of live armed conflict. But UNODC is also one of the few actors that has the capacity to intervene in these conflict, post-conflict, and security challenge settings. We have ongoing counterterrorism programs running in most of these countries, including in Burkina Faso, Iraq, Mali, Mozambique, Niger, Nigeria, and Somalia. For example, in Mozambique, we've been delivering capacity building on criminal justice responses to terrorism in the Cabo Delgado province, where terrorists stage raids, execute civilians, terrorize, or kidnap civilians, and otherwise seek to seize and control territory. In Nigeria and Burkina Faso, we're helping with the effective adjudication of terrorism cases, resulting in more convictions through judicial processes, as well as exonerations based on evidence in judicial proceedings, thus alleviating conditions of indefinite or arbitrary detentions, therefore supporting human rights. Now, I happen to be speaking to you right now from Mozambique. where we're delivering a comprehensive program of support to prevent organized crime and terrorism. And GTI's 2023 report could not have been launched any more perfectly timed as it is now, because with the GTI report in hand, I am able to go meet with policymakers and with the leaders of the international community and to advocate both in terms of opportunities, but also the threat and the trends as shown in the evidence in the GTI, to make the case that time is of the essence and more multilateral support is urgently needed here before the risks aggravate and spread more widely in the region. Let me move to the third GTI conclusion I'd like to highlight on ideological terrorism. Ideological terrorism continues to be the most prominent and deadliest form of terrorism in the West for the third consecutive year. The rapidly shifting nature of the terrorist attacks based on xenophobia, racism, or other forms of intolerance based on religion or belief, which is a mouthful, I assure you I know because I have to repeat it several times in every presentation. And there is XRIRB, or excerpt, if you would allow me, as a shorthand. That excerpt over the last several years has been growing, and it is a growing concern among countries regarding the transnational threat posed by these groups. Excerpt varies in the ideology that they draw from, but are often linked by hatred and racism towards minorities, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and radicalized actors have maximized the use of the online space to build networks, increase their reach, their influence, mobilize supporters, and fundraise transnationally, as well as spread conspiracy theories against ethnic, religious, gender, and minority groups. Now, while numbers are low in comparison to other countries in the index confirms that this phenomenon now represents the most serious threat in Western countries, threats to national security and to civilians, necessitating increasing attention from law enforcement, intelligence, and counterterrorism agencies. To support countries on this front, we've developed a manual on prevention and responses to excerpt. And the manual has two central aims. First, to raise awareness of the threat posed by excerpt, and second, to identify legal, operational, and administrative national measures implemented by member states to counter these threats. Now, here again, the Global Terrorism Index launch could not be more timely, because tomorrow I leave Mozambique and head to Germany, where the government is partnering with UNODC on this very issue to raise awareness globally and to develop solutions for countries that need it. I'll be sure to have in my hand and quote GTI's data and analysis to convince any countries that doubt that this threat is real. Now, these conclusions are also in line with the outcome of recent consultations we undertook with a broad range of stakeholders, including governments, civil society, regional organizations, private sector, and academia. We also learned, among other things, that the threat has changed, that it's now more fragmented. The threat is not as clearly defined as it once was, and many different manifestations of terrorism are now observed. Internationally organized terrorism has been suppressed and scattered in some places, but in other places, terrorist tactics have been adopted by smaller armed groups with local grievances. We learned that prevention policies and practices have been underutilized, but can be highly effective and cost-effective too. Some counterterrorism responses may be well-intentioned, but can contribute to conditions that lead to radicalization and violence. We also learned that centralized top-down solutions are not as effective to counteract manifestations of terrorism that are rooted in local grievances. And finally, more than ever, there is a need for rule of law-based responses and human rights mainstreaming in counterterrorism solutions. Based on these and other findings, including those in the Global Terrorism Index, we developed a new evidence-based global program to prevent and counter terrorism. And this program offers solutions that are more inclusive, involve more women and young people and other stakeholders, invest in prevention, promote the rule of law, and mainstream human rights. Now, looking forward, it's clear to us in UNODC that terrorism has evolved from a phenomenon that 20 years ago was a geopolitical concern that required top-down approaches. It's now a tactic that is employed by a whole host of actors with various grievances and causes And these are often, again, local grievances. Global jihadism as such does not appear to be the motive for many of the actors, at least in the Sahel region. A trend that is confirmed by the data and analysis presented in the GTI index. And so I invite you to read that section very closely. In the Sahel, as the world's epicenter of terrorism today, the political inability of governments in the region to provide effective security has encouraged terrorist groups to continue their activities by controlling territory and making the Sahel increasingly more violent, and terrorists have been able to exploit socio-economic political vacuums as well as local grievances. So a multidisciplinary approach is needed to address these issues. And in step with this reality, UNODC is scaling up its initiative that aims at reducing the impact of terrorism there and elsewhere with similar conditions. We integrate approaches that support inclusiveness and participation of all those affected. We're working to increase our attention to addressing the root causes and conditions conducive to terrorism, including poverty, social exclusion, and inequality, and supporting the development of community-based programs. We strongly believe that these approaches will go a long way in complementing our traditional action in strengthening legal frameworks, enhancing criminal justice system, and promoting cooperation between countries. Just to highlight a couple of areas where we have identified have been gaps in counterterrorism for decades, which we are now addressing. Women can play an important role in preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. As such, we've developed various initiatives that empower women to take an active role in preventing and countering terrorism, and we adopt and we train countries in gender-sensitive approaches. We recognize that men and women have different experiences and vulnerabilities when it comes to terrorism, and we ensure that our programs are designed to address their specific needs. The other gap that we have identified and we are filling is youth. Young people who lack education, employment, and training are more vulnerable to narratives of radicalization and the glorification of violence. And so we are reaching out to young people and to the youth, and we recognize that especially in Africa, in some countries, the young people are the majority of the population, and they're the most vulnerable, and also a rich environment in which violent extremists seek to recruit followers. Now, we have identified in these last few minutes key findings of the Global Terrorism Index, but there's much more in it, and I intend to make it a required reading for everyone on my team, because I believe that when it comes to advocacy and raising awareness and developing solutions, nothing is more convincing than data and current data and relevant data. And I think that the GTI is a gold mine for that purpose. We do believe that the GTI's data are in line with our own understanding that human rights violations in the name of counterterrorism is counterproductive. We believe that human rights principles can be and should be respected while countering terrorism. Indeed, we've been effectively mainstreaming human rights principles in our technical assistance to countries for years. And this was corroborated by the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion of human rights while countering terrorism. So I believe that the 2023 Global Terrorism Index can similarly offer evidence to counterterrorism practitioners and policymakers globally, regionally, and locally to re-examine their counterterrorism strategies, policies, and practices, to apply lessons learned by others, and to develop new responses that are informed by the latest data and emerging trends. The 2023 Global Terrorism Index should be leveraged as a catalyst for change, for fresh thinking, for evidence-based strategies, and more effective responses to the ever-evolving terrorism threats. Therefore, it is a must-read. So allow me to conclude here by congratulating and thanking the Institute for Economics and Peace for this important contribution to the cause of peace, development, and human rights. And I wish IEP and all of the participants in today's launch great success in our shared mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karimipour. I see that the audience has been very active in asking their questions to both of our speakers. I'm going to ask a couple of them now, and we'll see how many we can get through. I'll start with a few of the more technical questions that might have a little bit of a shorter answer, and then we'll engage in some of the trickier questions that the audience has asked. So first of all, for you, Steve, is the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war included or reflected in this report?
Yes, the answer of it is. So at this stage, terrorism is not a major concern as yet in the Ukraine. So the deaths over there are recorded as battlefield deaths or civilians which are killed in this an offshoot from the war. However, what we would say is that there's a draining of resources out of Africa, which is moving in to support the Ukraine. So first you would see is the Wagner Group, mercenaries, which they did have operating in the Sahel. They've been moved over and are now fighting in the Ukraine. Armaments and money which may have been spent on weapons and supporting the Sahels more likely to be directed towards the Ukraine, simply because the amount of energy and efforts it's taking to fight the Russians there. The other thing which I say, which I think is really important, it's intellectual bandwidth. So is Europe in particular and the US get drawn in to thinking about the Ukraine war and the offshoots, but it does give the opportunity, unless we stay focused on terrorism, particularly in the Sahel, Afghanistan and Syria, that it could really take off again, because these terrorist organizations are not going away. For example, the Islamic State is active in 21 countries where it caused deaths last year. So they're broad spread, they're very adaptable, and I think there's a real need for us to stay focused on the Sahel. So it's mainly sort of lack of resources, lack of intellectual capital going towards terrorism because of Ukraine.
Thank you. And the second question that I'd like to ask is, what constitutes ideological terrorism in the West? How do you define this?
Well, ideological terrorism consists of what you would call a left or right wing subscriptions to radical ideologies. And so, look, there's all sorts of examples of it. But I think when you're looking at the ideological radicals, what you find is that most of them might subscribe to some form of ideology. It could be anons, it could be conspiracy theories, it could be the world's run by Kabul, could be a whole range of different things. So so it's very hard to put it down to any one ideology. But certainly none of the terrorist attacks, which we could see anyway in 2022 during the West, which were ideologically motivated, the participants weren't a member of a group. They're all lone actors, but subscribing to different theories and different ideologies. Masood may have a comment on that further because he studies that in more detail than what I do.
I would second what Steve said. I think that for us, we're also mindful of free speech and the need not to criminalize pure speech. But when it's incitement to violence, it becomes a criminal act. When it turns into actual violence or threat of violence, it becomes a criminal act under the laws of the countries in which it takes place. And then, of course, judicial and criminal processes kick in. And we have a role in raising awareness about the increasing threat and to help countries study the phenomenon and to find solutions that are in line with both their laws and international conventions, so that we don't face a situation where an overreaction results in the criminalization of free exchange of ideas or prosecution for speech alone. So we are mindful of the need for balancing this response against international obligations, of course, for the UN, and we are always guarding what exist as international obligations of member states to both enforce their own laws, but also to uphold fundamental human rights values. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question that we had from the audience that perhaps both of you would be able to touch on has to do with the role of technology in terrorism. If you've seen any changes as regards to the use of technology on either any aspect related to terrorism globally. Steve, perhaps you could speak to this first.
Sure. Look, obviously technology is changing all the time. And so there are new platforms come up, there are new ways of reaching your audience, you get new encryption programs come up, it makes it easier for people to communicate under the radar. But probably I'll just come in and focus on one point. That'd be drones. So the advancement in drones in the last decade has been really quite remarkable. And although they're not used excessively in terrorism as yet, but we do know groups like Houthis, Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram have all used drones. And they'll use drones for simple things like reconnaissance, check out a village or something before they go in. They'll also, the future of drones is going to get quite problematic. So if we're looking at the moment, you look at a military grade drone, it can fly up to 1,500 kilometers. Last year, this wasn't classified as a terrorist attack, but it's an example of what we're up against, is a Iranian supplied drone, traveled probably 800 kilometers from Yemen into Saudi Arabia to attack the Americo oil refinery. And so that's substantial to launch attacks like that with a drone. Now, sort of there are lots of commercial drones. I think the global market for drones is about $7 billion. And so a lot of the cheaper drones, which anyone can buy, you or me, can travel 1 to 5 kilometers without too much trouble. So as we're looking forward to the future, the concerns I've got with drones is that you can use them for targeted assassinations. So let's say you object to an election and you want to target all the people standing for office in a region. Using drones where you're flying them from some 500 meters to 2 kilometers away is quite a viable option. You could also put things like radiological waste in drones, which you could then scatter over a commercial district. It gives the ability to put payloads into drones, fly them into a market. Now, if we're looking at military installations, generally they can be fairly well protected. You can have the radar systems to be able to detect drones coming. You can then have obviously the countermeasures to shoot them down. But if we're starting to look on a broader scale, it may become more difficult. Now, I think this is an area which I don't think is in the area of terrorism. We've really thought through how do we go about actually controlling and stopping this.
Thank you. Masood, did you have anything to share on this topic?
I do, but I just want to make sure that my comments are not addressed to any specific case or incident. But I think generally we have seen a sharp increase in the level of sophistication of terrorist groups, exploitation of technology in all its various forms for all of their operational purposes, starting with recruitment, radicalization, financing, moving money, using crypto, using dark web, and using digital technology to both conduct their business, but then to also hide their tracks so they become harder to detect. And this is an area of particular concern for UNODC because we're in the business of supporting member states counter threats. And what we are seeing is an increasing gap between the degree of sophistication of terrorists in use of technology and the capacity of member states' investigative bodies to keep up with that technology. And the enormous. And of course, we have to close that gap, and that requires quite intensive engagement and capacity building. In fact, many countries even lack the legal framework and the legal tools that they need for digital investigations. But we develop solutions for them. So, for example, an investigative authority in one country wants to identify who's behind certain criminal activities online, yet the evidence of that is on a server several continents away and behind half a dozen legal walls. And that evidence is needed this afternoon, not 6 months from now. And so we developed a platform of cooperation among countries. We found solutions to the legal barriers, and we're able to act as a facilitator to bring the requesting and the providing countries together in real time to share information so that investigations can proceed and terrorist acts can be stopped in the planning stage. That said, it is a great concern, and some of the things that Steve talked about are very real in the sense that something as cheap as a simple drone you can buy on Amazon can be put to nefarious uses to terrorize civilian populations or to interfere with aviation near airports. One might say, well, that's a little bit far-fetched. It's never happened before. Well, until a few years ago, no one thought that you could use civilian airplanes as bombs and ram them into buildings. And so we have to keep up with both the technological capacities of terrorists and their evil imagination, and to offer practical solutions to prevent. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'm going to use my my ability here as moderator to take a number of questions that we've had and kind of combine them all into one for our last 10 minutes here. A number of questions have come in saying, what is going on in the Sahel that's enabled this kind of epicenter of terrorism to form? We've also had questions that have asked, what can be done? Is there a relationship between corruption and terrorism? Is there a relationship between economic well-being and governance in Lebanon, for example, and terrorism? How do all of these different complex issues fit together? And to end hopefully on a little bit of a positive note, what do you think could actually be done by different actors around the world in combating terrorism? Steve, I'll start with you, and then Masood will hand it over to you.
So, Leah, why didn't you finish with a simple question? So okay. So from IEP's perspective, we've put a lot of work in the last 4 years in developing concepts around societal systems. So societies operate as systems, much like our physical body operates as a system. And so the interactions are complex. There's no concept of causality. You've got many different aspects interacting together. And so the more aspects which you've got, which will, for want of a better word, we'll say is in a negative state, the more impact the violence is likely to be. So now, if we move into the Sahel, what do we see? I've touched on some of them. So obviously, we've got weak governance. We've got poor span of the military or police in a lot of areas in the country. You've got rampant corruption. You've got a low level of competencies in the public service. You've got rampant criminality. You've got ecological stresses in a lot of places. First up is lack of water. If you've got a lack of water, you've got a lack of food. These areas also have really strong population growth, and they're also going to be quite negatively affected by climate change over the next 20 years. So you've got this, if you like, toxic mix. So from the perception of the Institute for Economics and Peace, these new frameworks we've got, and one in particular called HALO, for analysing societal systems, gives a starting point of trying to break it down and look at the way these systems dynamically function. So why do we call Halo Halo? Because sort of in many ways you can draw a lot of analogies, and we build a lot of our frameworks out of the concepts of systems in biology. So think of yourself, you can never really understand what's happening inside your body. You can only see it through different markers, like you take your pulse, you may look at your blood pressure and look at a whole range of other different factors. And so same for societal systems. You can't perceive them directly. You can only see what emanates from them, therefore, which you can see through data, surveys, expert assessment and such. So first thing I think is we need a much better ability to be able to do assessment of societal systems. And everyone talks about systems, but there's very, very little out there which is really well thought through and structured mechanism and approach to understanding. And I think we've got that with Halo. So now back to my own personal experiences, I think there's a lot we can do. So the first is like really need to be able to build up the capabilities of governments in these places. But first, the governments have to be willing and wanting to truly build up their capabilities, because changing, again, the systems within a government where a lot of it's run down, there's a lack of revenue by these governments to actually even be able to pay their staff. So therefore, a lot of the time, that's a breeding ground for corruption. We need to get much better at being able to focus on being able to capture water so that you can then provide food. And then from the food, you develop micro businesses built around the food. So you actually got value add for the local people. So we need to somehow be able to attack this whole concept, the ecosystem of water to food to small scale businesses in a systemic way. And then sort of, if you do it properly, you'll be able to actually now develop businesses which can actually self-fulfill in terms of improving the background conditions in these environments. But to do that, you do need some functioning of government services, and you do need some level of peacefulness to do it. So all of it comes together. You certainly need kinetic force through military and the police, because the criminal gang setting themselves up as jihadists aren't likely to lay down their arms and give up their profiteering without thinking there are consequences. So I think there's a lot more I could say on this, but I think at this stage I'll stop and I'll give Masood a chance. But I'm back to sort of we've really got to start at the basics, get a much better understanding of the systems, and they'll be different in different countries and even within different districts, definitely within different districts within those countries as well.
Thank you. Masood?
I think Steve wrapped it up very well. Very little for me to add. If I can highlight just a couple of factors, particularly since the questions seem to be focused on the Sahel, is the issue of weak governance, lack of basic services, and lack of social, economic, and educational opportunities for young people. These combine to create local grievances that go unaddressed. The government, because of the vast spaces and other factors that Steve referenced, has not been able to project its authority or its services into these vast spaces. And so it becomes easier for that space to be occupied by an alternative narrative, and that is that your government doesn't care about you, your government locks up your young people into detention camps arbitrarily and indefinitely. And then you wrap that in a gift wrapping of the jihadist call to action, which is very corrupt. When you talk to faith leaders, they completely reject that here. And so then it becomes a militant organization who's projecting its power through acts of terror. Two guys on a motorcycle show up at a market where people living in abject poverty who've never done anything to harm terrorists are mowed down in the name of getting attention and projecting power. And so it's a combination of factors. And the There are things that can be done concretely, and we're in the business of doing that, but some of it is requiring the political will of national authorities to invest more in social economic opportunities, to build resilience at the community level, to offer good services and goodwill to people, so the community becomes more resilient against such narratives of radicalization. I also wanted to touch on a couple of other things, which is that you need to broaden the set of stakeholders that you consult. For too long, counterterrorism has been left to the domain of government institutions of security and justice, which play an important role, critical, and the military too in these regions. But they can't do it alone, and in some ways, they can, even as good intention as they may be, contribute to conditions that create vulnerabilities for recruitment, such as showing up in a village and throwing hundreds of young men into camps and calling it counterterrorism. And there may well be some terrorists in those camps, but they're also the shoemaker and the shepherd and the breadwinner of the family. And so now you've thrown fuel on the fire of radicalization by such a heavy-handed approach. And so we are helping countries couple those responses with judicial responses, and we've helped develop the capacity to screen people in detention camps and to convict the guilty and to exonerate the innocent and restore people back to their communities. Just a couple of other final thoughts is that when it comes to answering the question of what more can actors do, I think along the lines that we've talked about, the multilateral approach is working and is working more effectively than I think some bilateral approaches. I think countries loaning their military resources is fine, but the military alone cannot solve these problems. So you need the multilateral approach based on the principles that we've talked about. And finally, you can't phone it in. You can't phone in counterterrorism. You've got to go to the country. You've got to work with the actors. You've got to better identify their needs and their vulnerabilities and develop custom-tailored programs to that country, to that region in that country. And so as a counterterrorism event that I went to where we talked to local community leaders and faith leaders, they said they want to see the international community stop what they call counterterrorism tourism, which means that they blow into town and they have conferences in five-star hotels and they send out tweets and go home and think they've done something about counterterrorism, where in the assessment of local leaders, they've done nothing but waste time and resources. And so I encourage partners who are interested in making a difference is to work with UN entities that are on the ground, are staying there and are delivering there, and who are very plugged in and have the ownership of the countries so that whatever you do delivers impact. Sorry I took too long.
No, to quote one of our audience members, bullseye, Masood, bullseye. So with that, and we have to wrap up today's session. I want to thank you both very much for presenting the report and your work with us today. I hope the audience has really taken the most recent results and will be able to apply this and utilize this in their work themselves. You can visit www.visionofhumanity.org to access the full report, which I highly encourage everybody to take a look at. The link is also posted in the webinar chat, along with all the channels that you can communicate with IAP. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you very much, Leah, and thank you for hosting us.
Thank you, Leah. Great job hosting. Thank you, Steve. Great report. Cheers.
Thanks, Masood.